Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us. I'm Christine Parthemore. I'm the CEO of the Council on Strategic Risks. CSR is a nonprofit, nonpartisan security policy institute devoted to anticipating, analyzing, and addressing systemic risks to security, with a special attention to the ways in which these risks coordinate and converge and exacerbate one another, which is the topic of today's discussion. Since 2016, we've run a program on the convergence of climate and nuclear threats. These are two of the greatest risks to international security in the 21st century, and they aren't occurring in isolation from one another. The strains of climate change effects, various nuclear threats rising, and other trends are reshaping the global security environment in really profound ways. This is certainly altering the world order that has been shaped through much of the last century. And international norms and institutions are being further stretched by other technological and socio-political changes, including prospects for autonomous weapons and other tech that is reshaping how we think about conflict, deterrence, diplomacy, and defense. I'm so grateful that today many of our colleagues, including Natasha, Dr. Natasha Bajema and Andrea Rezzonico, have assembled several great minds in the field to help us talk about this particular set of issues. And I include them when I say some of the greatest minds on these issues in this conversation. Dr. Peter Singer is strategist and senior fellow at New America. He's the author of multiple best-selling and award-winning nonfiction and fiction books. His most recent is Burn In, a novel of the real robotic revolution. It's receiving just as much acclaim as his previous works, which very often wind up on the must-read list by defense leaders in the United States and around the world. Rear Admiral John Gower is a senior advisor with us at CSR, and he's done really important work on nuclear strategic stability and the future of arms control. This builds on a long, distinguished military career in the UK, for which his final post was Assistant Chief of Defense Staff, Nuclear, Chemical, and Biological in the UK Ministry of Defense. And that's where I first met him when our countries were coordinating with many others around the world to try to destroy much of Syria's chemical weapons program many years ago. Dr. Schoonover is founder and principal of Ecological Futures Group, among other hats that he wears, including joining us with our Center for Climate and Security. He served in the US intelligence community for a decade as the Director for Environment and Natural Resources at the National Intelligence Council, and he was a senior analyst in the Bureau of Intelligence and Research at the US Department of State. We had planned to be joined today by former UN Deputy Secretary General of the Conference on Disarmament, Anya Kasperson, but she lost her voice. We hope she's able to join us in viewing today, and we thank her for her intent to join us and share her ideas, though I'm sorry that we won't be hearing from her directly. Natasha, over to you.
Thanks so much, Christine. Welcome, everyone. Just a few notes before we get started. So today's webinar discussion is divided into 3 segments. We'll start out with a discussion about the future of global order. Then we'll come to the current times, which seems like more like global disorder. And finally, we'll close out with converging risks, looking at diving deeper into the risk across nuclear weapons, climate change, and lethal autonomous weapons. Peter has to duck out early for another meeting. For this reason, after each of the segments, we'll do a very short Q&A with a final Q&A after the 3rd segment. If you have a question for the panelists, please use the Q&A feature. If you see a question similar to yours, you can feel free to upvote it. And without further ado, we'll get started. So we're going to kick off with a kind of more philosophical discussion about the future of the global order. And Peter, you've been out front on many profound technological, political, and societal changes in your nonfiction and fiction work, most recently in Burn In, co-authored with August Cole. These novels are speculative, set in the near future. They almost feel like they're happening today, and yet there are things that you are kind of forecasting for the future. Your latest novel, you portray a future about robotics and autonomous systems that I think has implications for the future of the global order. Just a couple of kind of scene setters from your book. Global society is more connected than ever before over internet-enabled devices. Automation and machine learning have overhauled the job market, replacing many jobs and creating high levels of unemployment while still having a lot of economic prosperity. Companies in control of massive volumes of data are experiencing unimaginable wealth. But what hit me most in your book was this kind of suggestion that the expectation of social advancement has been shattered. The social contract between society and government potentially leading to a decline in the nation state as a way of organizing human affairs. And we've been organizing nation states for a couple of centuries. And since the end of World War II, they have been the linchpin of our global order. And so my first kind of question to all of you, but starting off with Peter, do you think we are witnessing a decline in the nation state system as we've known it for the past century? And if so, what are the implications for the future of global order?
Let me begin thanking you for the kind introduction, and also everybody who's working the back end of the logistics of this. Doing these meetings are not always easy, so really appreciate that. Wow, big, deep question that cuts across a number of issues. I think about it in a couple of ways. The first is the framing of the book. The subtitle of it sort of gives it away, where it says a novel of the real robotic revolution. And this is a bit of a pushback against the narrative that's played out both in science fiction, but in the real policy world. In the science fiction realm, it's about, robot uprising. In the policy world, it's the whole debate around killer robots and existential threats related to AI. And the bottom line is, while we may one day have to decide whether to salute or fight our metal masters, and you're in my lifetime, it's more about living through equivalent to an industrial revolution. And if we think back to the last industrial revolution, you had both economic and political winners and losers. And the dynamics of that played out at the individual level, the industry level, but also at the national level. It's part of the story of the rise of the US. It's part of the story of the end of the Ottoman Empire. And that as we rewire our economy in the real, and we rewire our systems of war, applying AI, whether it's part of the US National Defense Strategy to China's 2030 vision, we will see this similar story of winners and losers. And that one part of it, yes, is that it reinforces the power of small groups and individuals compared to the state. We have an example literally today on this. It was just revealed that Houthi rebels launched a ballistic missile and drone attack, their largest one yet, on Saudi. This would have been, unbelievable 15 years ago, and there's where we're at right now. The second real rapidly issue is that we framed the AI situation sometimes as a arms race in parallel to the Cold War arms race. And no, this is different. It's a technology that will be in everybody's hands, state and non-state actors, weak and strong. But the arms race is really about two different visions of AI, whether it's the Chinese government-led centralized vision that does reinforce the power of the government in terms of its social control, versus a different model, more the sort of democratic world model, where you will have lots of different players, each using AI, and not a seamless sharing of information across. So, Google versus Facebook versus government. So it's a model of centralization versus distribution. And the Cold War parallel would be which one the battleground states choose, comparable to the third world back in the day. Which does a Fiji, which does a Nigeria, which model do they choose? And then that has global resonance.
So when I think about climate change, I think about the nuclear weapons global order, I think about lethal autonomous weapons. There's obviously differences in which stakeholders play a role in each of those. For nuclear weapons, nation states have been front and center. But I think for other areas, especially lethal autonomous weapons, you just mentioned the drone strike, but also biology, we're seeing private sector take an increasing role in developing these technologies, unlike in the past where departments of defense around the world basically were the leaders in development. How do you think that affects our ability to basically collaborate at the multilateral level through nation states?
Well, I want to start with just agreeing with everything that Peter said. And my analogy is that I don't think it's the end of the nation state, but I don't think the nation states themselves generally realize how close the end may be. And the analogy I use is that the sort of Treaty of Westphalia brought us onto dry land, and we've been operating on dry land And we've been slowly over the last 20 years going back into the sea, and I think we're just getting out of our depth as nation states. And my worry is that we don't realize that, and we're going to pretty soon feel like drowning when we look at some of the changes, as you've indicated, economic, social, military, AI, climate change, all these pressures where the nation state is being subverted, not by rebels, but by the way in which society is moving. And what worries me, it's going to thrash around like a drowning man, the nation state, and particularly those with a lot of power. So I think the biggest question is, how do the nation states try and deal with this emasculation of their sovereignty and power, which is inevitable? And the problem with, particularly in my area, with nuclear weapons that are quite easy to use, and an increasing number of them that are quite easy to use, if you're thrashing around feeling you're drowning as a nation, it's awfully tempting to see if that would be one of your problem solutions. So the problem for me is I don't think the nation states think they can cope with this. I think this is an inexorable process, and it's how we adapt to it that's the issue.
Christine, I'm wondering if you can say a little bit about your views in the biological space as CSR is getting into this area much more deeply in the next year. To what extent do you think the private sector is undermining the role of the nation state to make decisions about countering biological threats at the multilateral level?
Yeah, so businesses and even individuals in the biological space are having a profound impact. And it is, if you will, undermining the sort of concentration of nation-state focus in terms of shaping world events and these things. Where I've come around on some of these questions, though, is that in some ways I'm not sure that's a bad thing, right? So in the biological space, there are threats that nation-states like some of ours and many others have done a great job of countering in the past decades and even in very recent years. There are other ways, and one of the things we're exploring is whether companies and individuals, academics, empowered individuals who are networked together can do just as well, if not better, at countering some of the other types of biological threats that are out there. So nation states having a monopoly on governing world order and international norms and things like that, it could be sort of a good thing or a bad thing. So several years ago, I would have said, you know, we need to keep the global order as it is 100%, but it's pretty clear that in many ways it's failing a lot of people around the world. So my thinking has sort of shifted to more embracing the non-state players in the field. There are a lot of treaties and norms and institutions that I think are absolutely critical to maintain that have been built and nearly universalized over the last decades. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty being one of them, of course, Paris being another, as sort of the cornerstones guiding us at the international level. But we need to recognize there are both challenges and also huge benefits to individuals and businesses and others playing in the space of trying to, certainly driving certain threats in different ways, but bringing all of those other assets in the world outside of the nation state system to bear against threats, I think is critically important to how we solve these things and address them going forward.
Peter, did you have something to add?
Yeah, one of the themes that we explore in the new book is the trend of what you might call super empowered individuals. And, you know, we're not talking about superpowers, you know, Avenger style, maybe the parallel of Tony Stark in terms of individuals who have access access to tools and technologies and influence that nation states just 15 years ago would have dreamed of. And, you know, to echo Christine, you can see that in some ways for the good. Think about the impact that individuals have had on topics that range from global climate change to recently public health, particularly compared to how certain governments have utterly mishandled it. The challenge of it is that these individuals come into it with one, not the sense of they don't have to respond to in a nation state when you're talking about a democracy, all the different competing interests, and two, they come into it with a mentality that reflects where they're from, how they're trained, etc. And in particular, the super empowered individuals of our world today tend to mostly be kind of Silicon Valley tycoon style. And that means they have a very particular way of looking at the world. They tend to see most problems including really complex social, political problems, as something, that you can find that one single engineering solution towards. And that can, in some situations, warp it. And so, we tried to play with that in the book, but I think we see it again and again. It's like everything else. It can have a good effect, but it can also have a very bad effect. But it certainly does change the interplay of politics on kind of the global stage.
Thanks, Peter. So before we move on to global disorder, any final comments from the panelists?
Well, let me jump in and just very briefly, my own sense is that states remain relevant going forward, although they're not the only game in town. And during my time at the National Intelligence Council, we published a document called Global Trends that spoke to many of the issues that have already been discussed. And, I agree with nearly everything that's already been mentioned. I think one of the points in that document is that because of a variety of things happening demographically, socially, politically, just governing itself is hard. And governmental institutions, especially international governance institutions, are increasingly mismatched to the problems that arise. And so this sets up conditions where traditional governments working on their own, nation states, to fall short and cause feelings of exclusion and grievance. At the same time, we're seeing the growing influence of corporations and as was mentioned, individuals. And one really good example of like how far we've come since the 20th century is the example of the exploration of space. The idea that a private enterprise could not only play a role in space, but be counted on by the U.S. government to be the provider of some critical elements of space, space travel, would have been really unthinkable. But that's where we are, and I think it's really emblematic of this change that we're talking about in the global order.
So Peter, you mentioned empowered individuals. I have a question here from the audience. What is the best way for states to facilitate the participation of these empowered individuals in productive rather than unproductive ways?
It's a great question. I wish I had a good and ready answer to it. I think the most important is to try and channel it through means that are accountable. Let me put it this way. I think where these super empowered individuals have the most effect is a combination of where they identify government gaps. The issue has emerged too quickly, or because of some flaw in politics, it's not being paid attention to. So they go after the seams. Secondly, where they are drawing in not only their interest, but stakeholders already in that space. There's sort of this fun and kind of funny to watch sometimes where one of these individuals discovers a new topic, and it's like it'll often be a topic that people have been working on for years and years, and guess what? You don't have you're not the first person to recognize it, and second, you don't have all the answers to it. So I think when they create structures that allow them to draw in expertise and insight and stakeholders, they have greater effect versus when and we all know the examples that they waste a lot of money that could have had a good effect. And then the third is the accountability issue. Is there a means that they are constantly vetting to ensure that it's having the intended positive effect? And what is the process for that? And that avoids some of the issues that we've seen where it's not just wasted money, but it can actually prove to be pretty egregious. And a lot of that comes out of, bluntly, sort of the natural arrogance that someone who has become a super empowered individual, of course, they're going to think that they're better than everyone and have all the answers because, well, guess what? that's how they got to where they were, they believe. So, you know, kind of being self-aware of that. And again, we can see positive and negative examples of this. I hope that's somewhat useful. But more broadly, from a political standpoint, governments need to understand these actors have influence, track what they're doing. In turn, we should not, just because we need to remember the individual part. They do not have a monopoly on good sense, nor should they, when they act perniciously, get away with it without critique.
So before I go to John, one example that comes to mind are the UN messengers for peace. I know that Michael Douglas was the UN messenger for peace at one point, Angelina Jolie. And so that can be a way to kind of channel some of that engagement on global issues. John?
I think one of the challenges is the boundaries between these influential individuals and corporations and government and who does what. At the moment, people will look to government for some things and they'll look to corporation for other, and that's blurring. And the Rod's concept of, you know, Musk doing NASA's space missions, the challenge is how are governments going to understand which bits they're going to keep in government and which bits they're going to pass out. And I think this is part of not really understanding how the tentacles of life are, the control of it is spreading out from government. And the problem is, I think, when we start discussing the stability issues of climate change, AI, nuclear weapons and other things, is as instability mounts, then people will start instinctively looking to government, but it may have let go of some of the levers, or it may try and grab them in crisis. And I think that kind of added instability is something that worries me incredibly.
Yeah, so there are areas of this that, as said, are much more complex and harder, but let's also not forget some of the easier kind of soft things that can be done too from the governmental perspective. So in terms of the international nuclear order and the cooperation that we've seen in the past between the United States and Russia and others, another area that's really broken down is the science and technological exchanges between our countries. And that can be done, it doesn't have to be government to government, a very simple step to both spread the norms that the government is trying to push, but also just try to create the relationships that over time help to stabilize things and create greater shared understanding between our countries. Just fund scientists to do exchanges with scientists in other countries or people in other technical fields. That's a great way that the government can play a role. Another is just inviting people, superpowered individuals, people outside of government and other fields, just to talk more. So last fall, we had a great conversation with a world-renowned scientist who was baffled the first times that anyone in Congress just asked her to come talk. And she made a fantastic point of just people in political positions or otherwise in government, civil service, policymakers, just invite people from outside of government to have more conversations. The more we have the sort of silo between the government and non-governmental sector, the more it's going to be a challenge for us to find ways both to solve the threats that are out there and to promote stability, but also if the government, if nation states, no matter which state it is, feel like they're losing some of that control over norm setting in these fields. There are very simple things like that again, they don't solve the whole problem, certainly, but they're easy steps that can certainly be taken at really low cost.
Thanks, Christine. So I think we're going to move on to global disorder. I see a number of questions. Hopefully we can get to them at the end of this segment. So I'd like to turn to one of the historically most profound examples of global order, and that is the nuclear non-proliferation regime. The NPT was negotiated in the 1960s, entered into force in 1970, and has been credited with preventing widespread nuclear proliferation. But in recent decades, support for the NPT has started to wane, with growing divisions between nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states. Non-nuclear states argue that nuclear weapon states have not gone far enough to implement their disarmament obligations. Flash forward to the Trump administration, we've just seen one agreement collapse after another. Key arms control agreements, including the INF, the Open Skies Treaty, and we're worried about the New START Treaty and possibly also the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. John, help us understand how dire things are really in the global nuclear order, and is there a way to rescue it?
Well, I must say, I don't think I've seen it as dire as this in my professional lifetime. The last time it was worrying was when I was a young lieutenant at sea in a frigate with nuclear weapons. in the early 1980s, and we had Able Archer, which as a young lieutenant, I had no idea how close we'd come to a certain number of problems. And I think the issue you raise the current administration in the US, it sort of is the most drowning of the drowning men, because when the solutions that are needed are multinational, COVID-19 is a classic example of that. The current administration appears to be ditching everything that is collaborative and cooperative, in a view that if you do it alone, you can look after your own interests best. So when I was working with Christine and Andy and others, I count 2012 as just about the most, maybe 2011, 2012. I was at my most positive then. The previous president had made a really interesting speech in Prague, and NATO and other countries had started going in a very strong direction. We have completely, collectively flipped on that. And now we have the majority of the arms control, whether it be nuclear or conventional. And conventional arms control is really important in setting a trust bedrock for nuclear arms control, particularly in the European theatre. All of these are unraveling, whether it be Open Skies, INF, and the ones you mentioned, CTBT, well, not yet ratified by the US, but at least observed by it still. So there's not many things left to cling on. And the problem is that there is a complete lack of trust. There's a lack of trust not only on what people are doing and what they say they're doing, but there's a trust deficit that falls out of this skittling down of treaties that were deemed to be enduring treaties. And so even if you came up with a wonderful treaty and got everyone to sign it, there'd be zero trust at the moment as to how long it would last. And so I think that it's not just the fact that these treaties are collapsing. It's not just the fact that there is a clearly new arms race in technologies to get around capabilities to try and make each other invulnerable. It's not just that, it's that no one is going to believe anyone. It's going to take 10 to 15 years of a new treaty and observing a new treaty for the levels of trust that we had in the late 2010s to re-establish themselves. So there's a very long lag from where we are. It's longer than going back to 2012, and that's the most challenging thing, because strategic stability is at risk and diminishing throughout all of this period. And so the focus should be on what do individual nuclear weapon states, and I don't mean just the 5 that are recognized by the treaty, what do individual nuclear weapon states do unilaterally to show and to shore up trust and confidence and restraint and all of these things, because there's nothing much going to happen bi or multilaterally looking out there. I mean, I've got more to say, but I think I'll stop there and let some other people talk.
So I guess I have a follow-up question to that. Oftentimes, the development of nuclear weapons is portrayed as a fairly simple decision. We all know that's not the case. It's not that simple. We're going to develop nuclear weapons. You have to have the resources. You have to be able to extract those resources from society. Today, in most democratic countries, the private nuclear energy sector is owned by the private sector. So dipping into that would require extreme circumstances. So if things get worse, I'll just ask that question. If things were to get worse, if the United States were to test nuclear weapons, leading to kind of a potential unraveling of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, if the US and Russia failed to extend New START, do you see other countries suddenly getting interested in nuclear weapons? Do you see a future full of nuclear proliferation, or do you think that question has been answered?
I honestly don't know, because my gut instinct is it will take quite some time, not just the physical problems with proliferation. It would take quite some time for new nuclear armed states to emerge, but they also might take time for them to decide to emerge. So I think if you say that one clear result of breaching the test ban, the taboo on tests, because if you haven't ratified it, you're not bound by it, is going to be more nuclear weapon states. Well, I think that's not the right thing to flag up to your current administration, because they will say, I think it's unlikely in any remaining possible terms of the current president. It's a longer problem than that, but it might start. I think the bigger problem is that other states currently with nuclear weapons would test, simply because why wouldn't they? There's a macho element to testing, which was one of the problems in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. And I think it would be very difficult for other countries to, well, particularly competing superpowers, not to test. And you mentioned the cost. I mean, that's almost the biggest problem. We're looking at COVID-19 and coming out of that, the sort of costs that governments are going to have to dig into, not only to solve the extreme borrowing and relaxation of any fiscal rules across this, if they have money across the world, but also when the inquiries start rolling in about how unprepared nations were, how much money you're going to have to spend. And that's setting aside the amount of money you've got to spend on climate change. So I think the cost of more nuclear weapons than you need for strategic stability is huge. And that's going to be challenging even for a country as relatively wealthy as the US. So I think the cost burden of this is going to be as important as the burdens of propriety and adherence to the Non-Proliferation Treaty.
Yeah, I would agree. And hopefully some of these factors will help pull us back away from sort of the state that we're in terms of the modernization programs of current nuclear weapons possessors. I likewise don't know in terms of the broader proliferation question, but I'm very worried about what happens just short of that as well. So if the Non-Proliferation Treaty and the system around it, there are already countries that are edging up on potentially not complying, or even just if it seems to be a very weakened system, or if countries just start pulling out of it, even if they don't have nuclear weapons programs, even if they don't even have nuclear energy programs today, the suspicion that's driven between countries and the actual hedging that some countries do with civilian programs in some cases, though it's exceptional, but just the huge suspicion between neighbors. If you look at the Iran and Saudi relationship in particular, anything that weakens nuclear norms in that region, even if neither country pursues nuclear weapons, that drives some of the conventional conflict and distrust between those countries that's creating such a horrific security environment there already. So even the more these nuclear norms weaken, even if you don't see new countries becoming nuclear weapon states, we're still in a really, really, really dangerous territory in terms of what nuclear weapons countries do with their arsenals, and then what non-nuclear weapons possessing countries do to each other short of the nuclear sphere, even in conventional conflict. I do think that, building on what John said as well, I think we need to be ready any day for countries, potentially the United States, unfortunately, but potentially others too, to conduct nuclear tests. And I think it would behoove all of us to start thinking very seriously right now about how the world reacts the day after that happens. So I agree that I don't think it would be limited to one country. I can't see other nuclear weapons possessing countries, unless it's to grandstand and say, I'm the responsible nuclear superpower by not testing, whereas country X just did. I can certainly see a ripple effect where at least 2 to 3 countries conduct tests, even if they don't acknowledge them or admit to them later. So unfortunately, I think that we're right on the cusp of that. So even the pushing the norms past they are on the non-testing point is going to put us in a really new space. And again, further precipitate that lack of trust that John so well articulated among countries. That'll make it even harder to rebuild these norms and institutions again later.
Just very quickly, I think the other challenge that we haven't covered, and I think we'll come into it because I see several questions relating to it, is the credit and credibility of the international organizations involved in all of this. If you can withdraw funding from the World Health Organization, probably the softest international organization on the planet, then what about the IAEA? What about the OPCW? What about the UN funding for all the issues that are the periphery of the global counter-proliferation and nuclear norms? These international organizations are what makes it tick. And if you're going to pull away from the WHO and others follow suit, then very soon you actually don't have to do anything other than defund the international organizations. And that in itself is a cooperation breaker.
I would just add, while I can see the merits of the argument for example, updating outdated command and control for nuclear weapons complex, that dates back to multiple decades before John was referencing Able Archer. And I can similarly see the logic behind, for example, not just the command and control, but even some of the systems themselves. The argument for starting up testing, to me, and I'm happy to be quoted on this, is infinitely stupid. It frankly does not have that logic behind it. And in many ways, I think it's mostly driven by a combination of one kind of ideological inertia. This is what we thought 30 years ago, so we must be willing to advocate for it today. And that what John referenced, which is sort of machoism. By advocating this, I look tough. But it does not, in my mind, unlike the other parts of the discussion, it doesn't have any logic behind it. It doesn't have a clear and compelling strategic need. It's just frankly people trying to look tough and clinging to a belief that is completely outdated. And I think you can see this, the difference of who's, when literally the former directors of people in charge of these complexes, weapons, are saying, no, actually we don't need it. When the experts are saying this, they ought to be listened to.
Very quickly, I agree entirely on the illogicality of it, but as Peter has said, but there's one area where a compelling case will be made by the nuclear weapons community of that country. And that is if you're designing a new weapon system that is completely parametrically different from the weapon systems you've had before. Let's say one that's traveling hypersonically, a super duper system, for want of a better name. If you're inventing one of those, then a very clear case could be made, well, we're not sure that our current warheads can travel at that speed and remain safe and efficient. We therefore need to design a new warhead, and we've designed a new warhead, we're not sure it's going to work. So I think one of the drivers towards potentially breaking testing is a bravely stupid new world where new weapon systems that have not been tried before are being designed for a whole host of stupid reasons, but you can make a case from within your nuclear weapons community that you need to test. And I think for that there is a logic. I know Peter said it's illogical, but there is a logic there within the system. And I think that is why these weapons, that is another reason, apart from their destabilizing effect, that is another reason why these weapons should be resisted. They're expensive, they're destabilizing, and they drive you closer to a need to test. I mean, what's not to hate?
Thanks, John. Along a similar disengagement vein, we could turn to the state of international climate order right now. The Paris Agreement, the most robust international accord to mitigate climate change impacts to date, aims to reduce global greenhouse emissions. Since 2016, every country besides Syria has become a signatory, with some states such as Turkey and Iran having yet to ratify it. 2019, we saw, after some delay, Russia formally join. But as we know, that same year, the United States began the process of withdrawing from the treaty and will officially leave in November of 2020, so in a few months. Rod, do you think this will have ripple effects on the greater global order? And if so, how do you think the UN could weather this or other international institutions?
Thank you. It's a great question. It already has had ripple effects in terms of how other countries at least view the trustworthiness of the United States on matters of international governance. And the United States helped create the system of international governance and multilateral institutions that we operate under. And certainly it's created an opportunity already for China to step into a leadership role on climate issues. But much of the world does not see it yet as the United States leaving the Paris Agreement as much as the Trump administration leaving Paris. And I think that's an important, although maybe temporary, distinction. And so let's step back just a bit and remind ourselves that the Paris Agreement, the way that it's structured, is largely because of the efforts of the United States, not entirely. Working with Europeans, long negotiations with China, the 2015 US China joint presidential announcement on climate change that kicked the door open for Paris, negotiations with Middle East countries and India. This took 7-8 years. And a new way of doing global governance came out of that. And it's still early to see if it will last the test of time. But for the US to back away from what they helped create was a significant blow to US credibility internationally. And there's really no way to sugarcoat that. And so now, that goes back to the question of whether this affects greater global order. And, the US will leave the Paris Agreement in November, irrespective of what happens with the election. But the Paris architecture will remain. US diplomats and experts have remained involved at the staff level, at the technical level, in the climate change discussions. Their efforts have so far not derailed the various processes. In fact, they've helped bolster a number of them. A lot of good relationships on the personal level between US diplomats and foreign counterparts probably has bought the US a little bit of leeway. The genius of the Paris Agreement is that it was intended to be dynamic and adaptive. And this genius didn't come out from the front end, it came out from the back end. But the idea is every 5 years, nations come together and take stock of where the world stood with respect to global emissions. And that ratchet mechanism, the one that we don't talk about enough, where countries come back every 5 years or so, it's incredibly important. It's still in place. But my worry, and I think this is a worry that will be borne out, is that without the US and other like-minded countries pushing and pushing and pushing on more ambition, we'll end up short. And I think the collapse of the Paris Agreement may come not because countries dropped out, but rather that they couldn't be compelled to take on aggressive mitigation actions. And I think that outcome may lead to, just because of the ramifications of the phenomenon of climate change and the rising grievances as seen in the youth climate strikes, I think this could lead to a substantial vibration, if not a risk, to the global order.
Thanks, Rod. To go for the panel in general, to kind of harken back to John's point of this theme of trust essentially fading in a lot of these international order mechanisms and treaties. If the Paris Agreement essentially the US were to pull out, obviously we still have other signatories, do we think it would take that much time, 10 to 15 years, to perhaps build up that kind of international agreement? Or could the global community weather this and be able to mitigate climate threats and climate security issues?
I think there is to me a nuclear security dimension to this, although it's not as imminent and as clear as the other security and economic dimensions. But both Sir Michael Quinlan and Lord Peter Hennessy, who are one no longer with us and one still in the House of Lords, have written long and hard on Britain's nuclear deterrent, and they both have one saying that they share, and that is, whatever you do, you should never make a state possessing nuclear weapons desperate. And I think the problems that are not yet, the conjoining that's not yet being seen properly, is the amount of desperation that the unmitigated effects of climate change are going to have on the nation state, whether it is through economic migration, whether it is through food shortages, whatever the pressures are, the amounts of pressures on a state are going to reach desperation in some areas. For instance, instead of a few economic migrants, what if the whole of Latin America decided it needed to come north because it was no longer able to support life? Now, that's not very close, but it's not very far away either, and on the worst predictions. And the kind of desperation that might raise a nation state to, I don't discount the fact that military lashbacks against that kind of major climate change induced global change, you can't rule those out. And so I think from my perspective, that is why you want to get rid of before that time. I mean, there is a window of opportunity from a nuclear security perspective, and it's not just nuclear, but that's the one that I look at. There is a window of opportunity whilst climate change is not being addressed. Even so, it's relatively slow, that we can get rid of the kind of easier to use weapons and the ones that are coming in that are new, that might be seen to be available to a desperate state.
Thanks, John. Christine?
Yeah, agree wholeheartedly with the comments for both. Rod raised an interesting point with the youth climate strikes, which for me has provided me more hope than a lot of other things in the world in recent years. And that gets me to thinking as well. So I agree with the assessment that it is going to change. It's going to have ripple effects, certainly, in the international order. It already has in very significant ways. You have people in the streets all over the world. And that certainly has had effect on how people behave with regard to other grievances as well. That may offer an interesting window for action on nuclear threats and other things, as John was describing. I think one of the biggest trends on this, especially with the youth climate strike thing, is that we just don't know. So some of those ripples could be very positive. You could see youth and the public writ large more engaged in global threats than we have in a very long time. And if that translates into political change that motivates governments and non-governmental actors to actually seriously address these threats in a very significant way and put resources into them, then that's good. There are lots of ways that we've touched on as well, though, that these things could, the ripples, while they're meant to just drive climate action, could actually also have the undue pressure of, I see a lot of the same youth groups and whatnot, for example, people having a profound distrust for the existing global nuclear order, who don't believe that it's done enough to address the nuclear weapons threats that we have today, and especially with countries that currently possess nuclear weapons, not in their perception moving quickly enough to reduce those arsenals. There's a potential negative effect in the nuclear side and other issue areas too, by which you really lose control of the government's ability to do what it thinks it needs to do for protecting the nation in other ways. So, and again, some of that may be good and some of that may be bad. And certainly there are people who think that it's all good or all bad. There's a whole spectrum on this. I think one of the biggest issues in this is that we just don't know yet. But when we're talking about the global order and things like addressing the climate crisis and nuclear threats, I think the thing that's very, very clear, though, is that we have to account for things like the youth strikes in our analysis, or we're missing a fundamental feature of the international system.
Thanks, Christine. Rod?
Yes, just very quickly, and those were two outstanding comments that followed my opening bit. Just touching on something that John mentioned about desperation. And one of the things that doesn't get talked about enough, I think, and it's really relevant in a security and a governance framework, is the period of locked-in warming that occurs that represents a difference between policy action and outcome in the atmosphere. It's 20 years or so, or more. And that sets governments and people up for a lot of misery between action and response. And while we're talking about governance and ambition towards carbon dioxide reduction policies, the flip side, what do we do during that locked-in period? How do we reduce vulnerability? How do we reduce misery is a critically important discussion that is usually left to individual cities or countries or nations to deal with. But two countries that are looking at a whole lot of misery, not 40 years from now, but 0 to 10, 0 to 20 years from now, are India and Pakistan. Both nuclear states, both have existing hostilities. If we're not worried about the overlap of climate stress and nuclear powers, I mean, this is a good example of an intersection between those two worlds, and it's serious.
That is the perfect segue to the next segment on converging risks. So we're going to switch gears and we're going to delve into what are the risks across nuclear weapons, lethal autonomous weapons, and climate change. And we're going to kick off with nuclear weapons and autonomous weapons. So the rise of autonomous weapons promises to accelerate the speed of warfare. The essence of war is speed, and the time is of the essence for nuclear deterrence. During the Cold War, policymakers worried about the 30-minute or less decision-making window for launching a retaliatory attack. John, I'm wondering if you can share your views on what you think the shift to autonomous warfare will mean for nuclear weapons. Since the end of the Cold War, experts have debated the tenets of nuclear deterrence theory and asked whether they can work in a multipolar world. The current view within the Department of Defense is that nuclear deterrence continues to work well, and for this reason, we need to modernize the U.S. nuclear arsenal. What do you think the speed of warfare in the future will do to this equation?
Well, I think the problem here is conflating warfare and nuclear weapons, which you should just not do. I know it's increasing in popularity in the US. The NPR was open on it, and subsequent documents that have been made briefly public by the Pentagon have exposed even wider and deeper thinking about this, all the time while pointing the finger at Russia and its so-called escalate to de-escalate. In other words, the use of nuclear weapons for warfighting. And I take Rod's point. I mean, both countries in the India-Pakistan area have strategic and warfighting roles for their weapons. And I think, therefore, the first thing you have to do is to declutch your nuclear systems from the concepts of the speed of war. And sadly, we're going in exactly the opposite direction with the two major superpowers. And I'm not sure about China, but I think they'll march step with whatever the other ones do. Therefore, I don't think, let us be positive and say that happens. Let us be positive and say that you manage to strategically place the other nuclear weapon states where, without blowing the UK's trumpet too hard, the UK it only has a strategic system, politically controlled, at sea and SSBNs, and no concept of fighting a war with those weapons. If you get to that stage, then the problem of autonomous weaponry in the conventional domain doesn't really have a direct impact, in my view. Where AI has a direct impact is in the situational awareness of the leadership who are making strategic decisions, which might include understanding what is happening in the strategic nuclear weapon domain, the ability to confuse, to fog up the war in a way that leads to misinterpretation and miscalculation. And that is as likely to be through accident, in fact, more so than it is through design. And the trouble is that the way in which nations are communicating with each other, and your president is in the vanguard of this, in doing major strategic policy by 140 or 280 characters at 3 o'clock in the morning on Twitter, is not assisting the kind of clarity of purpose that's needed to understand this. And when you bring AI into the intelligence domain to assist you in managing the massive amounts of data that you have, and you're presented by a machine learning or an AI enabled system, you've got to ask the question, what is being presented to you? And therefore the decision making, you don't actually have to have a Terminator. You don't have to have the weapons controlled by an AI. What you need to make this even more hazardous is you need the decision makers who are seeing what is essentially an idea of what the real situation is, but one that is driven by an AI and an ML system. So I think there's two threads. Firstly, if you take nuclear weapons to war, then the autonomy of war and the speed of war will take you to nuclear weapons faster. So that's bad. If you don't do that, you've got to be very careful about where AI and ML are working for your situational awareness upon which you make the decisions to use the other weapons. So in both ways, there is an impact, a potential impact of these in a negative sense, and you can ameliorate them by walking away from those weapons which are easier to use and have a warfighting, a necessary warfighting role, because then you'll train for it and you'll be ready for it and it'll be in your system. So, oh God, we just done it. So, so I hope that answers your question.
Oh, very much so. In fact, I wrote a novel on this, Rescind Order, coming out in June 30. Shameless plug, I know. But everything you said resonates with me. In particular, I think we underestimate how much this kind of situation that you hinted at, the situational awareness tools that could come out of mixing AI with nuclear weapons, how that could sneak up on us, how we don't realize that we're in it until we get there. And then all of a sudden there's a crisis situation and there's a lot of data flying at the tool and it's being displayed, and decision makers don't know whether they should trust the tool or trust something else, like the human instinct. And we've seen a lot of times over the course of history that human instincts have ended up preventing the worst thing from happening. John, you have something to say to that?
Yes, and I think that the other thing that's converging at speed is when you look at Able Archer and you look at other things from 1990 going backwards, largely the people involved really didn't trust the machines that were in front of them. So it didn't matter whether it was the machines in the Second World War all the way up till the mid-80s, maybe even into the 90s. I mean, certainly the majority of my sea service, most people looked at what the computers that were very young and stupid computers were telling them, and they'd largely look at them and go, nah, that's not right, I'm not going to do that. My kids, their generation, they largely trust what's on the screen. They trust what the computer, what the phone tells them. And I think that, and that's not a negative criticism, computers have got better. The error rate is much, much, much smaller, but the error rate's still too big for one when you're making decisions about exchanging nuclear weapons. So I think that sort of inbuilt cynicism about what a machine is telling you has gone from society. And that is going to accelerate the point you made.
Yeah, thanks for that. So one of the challenges when we talk about converging risks is that many of us are experts in one technology versus not all of them. And so we have to go down deep in our silos and try to talk to each other, but it doesn't work very well. So when I asked Rod to join us, I asked him to think about what are the convergences between climate change and autonomous weapons. And the one that I thought about that I'm not sure is even applies is if we think about World War III taking place and instead of soldiers, we think of robots. Does that have energy impact? I'm not sure. How does climate change affect the autonomous battlefield? I don't know. Rod, what do you think?
Well, I mean, there's two ways to answer this, but well, and the first one I'm not going to really discuss except just to list it. And there certainly would be an effect on war on the climate and on the environment, as it always does. But I want to switch it and think about certainly the effect of climate change potentially on autonomous systems. And so two of the defining characteristics of climate change are uncertainty and surprise. And when you drive a complex system like the Earth and its meteorological and ecological components, then surprise becomes more and more likely and eventually certain. The problem is that the nature and trajectory of that surprise is nearly always unpredictable. And we can explain it afterwards, but we almost always can't see it coming. And so for an example, trivial example, some nations in the Caribbean have been plagued by masses and masses of sargassum, a seaweed that requires daily bulldozers to clear beaches. Starting around 2011, they just appeared. And it's not a complete climate effect, but there is a climate fingerprint on it. In other parts of the world, extreme heat causes sudden instances of roads buckling and rails skewing, permafrost collapsing, depressed lift in airplanes. And these are just examples of the ones we've seen that just pop out of nowhere. So presumably, autonomous machines won't possess true artificial intelligence. I hope that won't happen for a long time. That means they have to be trained with data sets on environmental variables that have existed or currently exist. And it seems clear to me that when such systems experience novel conditions or discontinuities, again, brought in spades by climate change and climate-linked stresses, in the air, in the atmosphere, on land, in the ocean, I'm not convinced that these systems would respond predictably. And that seems to me to be a problem, not just in terms of lethality, but maybe some kind of concealed intent, or maybe pushing, maybe causing some effect in another country that was not intended, and so on. And so that's at least one dimension that I have been thinking about.
Yeah, I was just going to reflect, and I will admit that a copy of Rescind Order. I'm not going to say anything else, but you should buy it. It's an excellent read. But I will say that because it's sort of tangential to that, building on Rod's, if you can't make AI and machine learning predictable in the climate area, where it's probably the area where are the most data points on any science on the planet. I mean, during lockdown, lots of people in the UK spent their time transcribing rainfall data, digitizing rainfall data going back to the 1700s, and quadrupled suddenly the digital availability of this, which is extremely useful. But when you apply that to nuclear weapons, the number of data points you have, or nuclear crises, is scarily small. In fact, I would venture to say it's zero, because there is nothing about a multipolar nuclear crisis that we have ever had before. The only ones we've had have been largely bipolar. So I think there's a read across here. I can't answer the question, what about AI in the climate area? What effects have on nuclear, and vice versa? But the lesson is, if you can't get predictable results from your crunching of the massive amount of data available in the climate area, then you haven't got a Scooby in the nuclear area of having an AI system that's going to make it any better. I just don't think there's any way to make it better with AI in the nuclear crisis area. Zero.
I will agree with most of that. I'll throw in a little bit of a curve from my perspective on this as well. So I think there are actually really incredible uses for AI in understanding threats, and in particular in understanding the convergence of threats and getting us to think outside of our silos. But given the very real threats that you all outlined here, I think that what's required of that is to use these systems in the way it can highlight certain trends that we maybe bury in our analytical minds because of our unintentional biases or academic training or experiences or things like that. I think it can be a really powerful tool for teaching people how to think more critically. It's just that we might not be using them that way, right? So if we're using these systems more to try to find quick and easy answers and facilitate decision-making that could literally lead to the deaths of thousands of people, that's a very dangerous space. But they can be used to really enlighten different parts of what's happening in the world that, if you crunch all these data systems together, you can bring it out in a different way and really come to some profound realizations, and more so just become humble. So some of the problem in the nuclear weapons decision-making that we described is just the utter lack of humility about it, that political leaders who might have decision-making authority over nuclear weapons have to bring to the picture. When I've dealt with good AI systems, they're incredibly humbling in challenging the notions, challenging what we thought we knew about the world, and not in really significant ways that would alter decision-making, necessarily, but in those little ways that remind you that the world is a really complex place and none of us as individuals can really understand exactly what's going on. And I think that that could really bring some important insights into how we think about these things. Ultimately, if we have nuclear weapons and we're using these systems in a way that that oversteps or drives faster decision-making or amplifies disinformation and confusion and things like that, that's incredibly serious. We also run the risk, though, that if we're not addressing the nuclear dangers as they are, and then if we're not addressing them as they interrelate to growing autonomy in these systems and the use of AI and ML, then we're also potentially going to step further away from these systems in the way that we actually can learn from them. And they actually can be positive and augmentative to how we handle the global security environment, in particular in how we get out of these silos that are so harmful for us understanding the world and our security to begin with. So kind of a slightly different take on it. There's dangers and certainly everything with nuclear weapons that we've described, and dangers and how that comes together with autonomy. There's also a danger in us getting so far away from these systems that that we don't use them to their full potential.
Thanks, Christine. So wrapping up with our last question from our discussion, then we'll go over to the Q&A. Considering this conversation we've had and knowing how pressing these converging risks are and how they're unfolding in real time and will very likely continue to intersect in our near future and further down. So are these silos among these different risks, so climate, be it climate, nuclear, technology, are they coming down in how analysts in the US government or even other US or other governance systems, are they coming down in how these people analyze and think about security threats and international security? And if not, what could we do to maybe promote that kind of thinking and analysis?
I would love to tell the other panelists in the audience that the answer is yes. Unfortunately, the answer is a little. The silos are breaking down a little bit. And it's because, first of all, what we're doing right here, what you guys have organized on this panel, thinking about how long-term and mid-term risks converge is really hard. And, you know, there are, most of the government works in the intelligence community and other parts of the security community does not operate anymore as much looking at long-term strategy and strategic anticipation. It is almost exclusively tactical and operational. And it's a giant deficit, not just in the US government, but in governments worldwide. And I think a lot of what we're talking about in the confusion and the uncertainty and the breakdowns in governance add to this. And so there's a messy future that is really hard to parse out. But within just inside the intelligence community that I was aware of, I'll just tell you, it pains me to say, there's definitely a pecking order within the security community on what qualifies for national security. And hard security, nuclear, WMD, chemical weapons, those are more prioritized in terms of personnel, attention, resources, nuclear space issues as well. They sit at the big table, and then climate change is a late entry into the discussion. I think on an individual basis, a lot of analysts recognize that climate change is this very substantial threat, but the institutions don't reflect that. So there's a lot of room for improvement, in my opinion. And leadership matters in this regard.
Thanks, Rod. John, did you want to add to that?
Yes, I think it's even more dire in the UK. So don't get too depressed in the US. We used to have a Department for Energy and Climate Change. We got rid of that, and the climate change issues were suborned into another government department. And we have the same guerrillas in the intelligence and indeed the other worlds where money is allocated I would regularly get reports telling me that the yield of a particular Russian missile had changed by 2%. Somebody was working on this. This was pointless. It meant nothing to me. But we wouldn't get work on, there was no money in our intelligence world for the effects, firstly in the chemical and biological area, but also in the climate area. And when money squeezes, and we started with this, there's going to be no money for anything post-COVID-19. When money squeezes, departments in government draw up barricades, and the silos get stronger, not weaker. Even though think tanks are writing papers saying these are all linked, it is very difficult for the engines of certainly the UK government, and what I've seen of the US, it's equally challenging for people to look out over those barricades and say, hey, if we work together, we might achieve something and save money. It's very difficult to give up a bit of your budget to give it to someone else's. And I'm afraid we're about, certainly in the UK terms, we're about to go down another series of that post-19. In a different sphere, we're getting rid of the Department for International Development. This kind of diminution of what is very positive international work is hitting everything. It's a much more nationally focused view, and I think you feel the same in the US.
Just a brief call to action. I agree with all that, and Natasha and I experienced some of this in the Pentagon as well, where we were part of nuclear, chemical, and biological defense programs, which incorporates the nuclear weapons enterprise, and very often even the parts of the WMD spectrum don't talk to each other as much as they should. So I will put out a call out there for improving this. If a future administration or any governments out there would like to start breaking down some of these silos, I think a really great place to start would be in marrying up your nuclear policies, nuclear energy and nuclear norms and security and things like that, regulatory, with your climate change policies. So very often we have silos even between the climate and nuclear people. I've had so many conversations with people working heavily on climate action, including promoting nuclear energy, who have never heard of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. They don't understand how tenuous the future of nuclear energy is in terms of the fate of that treaty system, and if it collapses or weakens, the impacts on climate change that could potentially have based on the mechanism of the trends in nuclear energy that transpire. So I would say start there. If there are future government or current or future government folks anywhere in the world that want to break down some silos in these converging risks, this is where I would recommend we start.
Thanks, Christine. So we're at 1:15 or 2:15 for those on the East Coast, and we want to get to a few of the questions. Sorry, we can't get to all of them. So the first two questions I want to get to are about nuclear weapons, and I think I'll direct these at John. So the US has proposed moving towards lower yield nuclear weapons. Specifically, they have armed a sea-launched ballistic missile with a low yield nuclear weapon, and that actually deployed, I think, earlier this year. To what extent do these decisions normalize nuclear weapons, make offensive and defensive postures more indistinguishable, and basically more destabilizing? John?
Well, nuclear weapons are normalized in a number of countries. There's no normalization to be done in the US, frankly. They're normalized in the Pentagon, they're normalized in the White House, and these, the low yield ballistic missile, the new submarine launched cruise missile, these are weapons that are designed primarily with lower end nuclear use, nuclear exchange, and lower end implicitly in the mindset means easier to order. Your threshold is lower if the power of the weapon is lower, and I think these are just indicators. If you're not clear about what your policy is, your adversary or your potential adversary will only draw conclusions from what you do tell them. And if you tell them that you're building weapons that clearly look like the sort of weapons that you'd use at the high end of a conventional war to try and steer that conventional war in the way you want to go, then they'll react to it. And that's what we're seeing on the world stage at the moment. We're seeing a resumption of a race to populate what I thought in my naivety in 2012 we were depopulating, and that is the tactical and operational space for nuclear weapons. And I'm afraid, and I go back to my 1980s, I slept 3 meters from a nuclear weapon in a frigate. When I was a young man, everybody in the armed services expected to use nuclear weapons as part of any conflict that happened. We trained daily. You know, that's the 1980s, not that far away. And we dipped way down. And in the UK, we haven't come back up. We don't have any other systems. But these systems coming back are a real problem. And I think it's the mindset that they show, not so much the weapons themselves.
Anyone else on the panel want to comment before we move to the next question? Christine?
Sure, agree with everything said there. And we've had low-yield nuclear weapons for a long time, so I don't think that it's the low yield that's the specific characteristic that's so worrisome. It's some of the things that John described. It's the mindset for them, that these weapons are designed to be usable in warfare in an otherwise conventional conflict, with the thinking that if we use a low-yield nuclear weapon and deploy it on another country, that they'll just back off. And then we'll get a faster resolution to a conflict that way. My greater worry as well for folks like myself who still believe that we need to maintain a deterrent for some time as we move toward our treaty obligations to reduce and eventually eliminate nuclear weapons. Having weapons that are new capabilities, bring new features into the system, adds in a lot of confusion and tension. I'm much more worried about all of the new capabilities that some of our nuclear weapons and our modernization programs and others introduce, more so than whether they're low yield or not. Those new capabilities are introducing new dynamics, and the more we have and project this mindset that these weapons are usable, I think it actually undermines our deterrent overall and convinces countries that we aren't serious about having nuclear weapons simply to maintain a level of strategic stability that holds everybody short of major conflict. So even if you do believe that nuclear weapons have had a role in preventing another world war, I dubious a little bit on that argument myself. But even if you do believe that, these new types of weapons in many cases actually really undermine some of the very features of the system for those decades of continuity that were supposed to be the hallmarks of maintaining deterrence through that time. So there are all kinds of ways that both at the strategic level and in how countries relate to each other and trust one another and interpret the capabilities that we're developing that are extremely dangerous to the nuclear situation globally.
Thanks, Christine. So one final, we have one comment here. So one major risk across these converging risks is the desire to speed up the decision-making process, which we've touched upon in this conversation, when perhaps stability requires just the opposite. Increasing reliance on AI-enabled decision-making could make the destabilizing trend worse. Any reactions?
Yeah. Can I wind in another question that's linked to this because I think they bring together. So this is the question that Ben raised about norms for crisis avoidance and de-escalation. I think this is all part of the same thing, and anything that speeds up decision making in a nuclear crisis is not a good thing. I mean, it's the AR-15 against a musket. If you've got an AR-15, you can kill a lot of people. In a musket, you've got to, put the thing down. You calm down a bit while you're loading a musket. You're less likely to kill someone under the Second Amendment if you've only got access to muskets. So I think that anything that slows down the decisions is a good thing, and because that allows time for you to discuss the crisis with the adversary. And one of the problems, and this relates to Ben's question, one of the problems is which the nuclear states have not really grasped, in my opinion, is that this is no longer a bipolar problem. So even if the hotlines from one nation capital to another nation capital, even if they all existed or worked, and few of them still exist and even fewer work, that's no longer good enough, because an India-Pakistan nuclear crisis has implications for China and Russia and the US and everybody, basically, anyone who's got a nuclear weapon. So one of the things that is being worked on in the US, and I'm contributing to it, is looking at a nuclear crisis communications capability in the 21st century that allows you to biometrically know you're talking to the people. You can all get on or not get on, and it there's a whole load of things. Tech for GS is the people who are leading it. There's people from Google, from India, Australia. There's quite that some way of having the ability to talk in crisis between all of the heads of state or decision makers at whatever level in a nuclear crisis is absolutely necessary. The trouble is, if you accelerate your speed of decision making through the use of AI, you can set up the greatest consultation links on the planet, but you won't have time to use them because your own AI systems will be telling you, I can't afford to talk to this guy. I've got to make a decision now. And I think the lack of one and the approach of another is in a perfect storm in a nuclear crisis. So we need to slow one down and speed the other one up.
Well, thank you. That's a good problem to have. You always want to run out of time, not the opposite. So, and thank you to all the questions out there and to everyone who joined. The international order is a hard concept to get your brain around. It's even harder to understand exactly how it's changing. It literally is the international order and everything happening in the world. But what we at CSR, we're just convinced that we're not going to understand it, including how it pertains to things like nuclear threats and whatnot, if we look at it in its own little silo, and that we don't at least try to start talking comprehensively about how the climate crisis and nuclear threats rising and autonomy changing things, and all of these different trends come together and influence international stability and order and norms and institutions. So again, hopefully this is the first conversation of many to try and take a step in the right direction of coming up with a fuller vision of the global strategic environment and how that's changing the security landscape around the world for all of us. So thank you to everyone who's joined. Thanks to John and Peter and Rod and Natasha and Andrea for all having this conversation together. If you haven't yet ordered them, as we've said, Peter and Natasha both have books either out or coming out shortly that I encourage you to check out. You can follow more of our work at CS Risks on Twitter. That's at CS Risks. And for everybody out there, please stay safe and stay well. Thanks for joining us.